My guest today is political journalist and best-selling author Amie Parnes. She is co-author of the fascinating new book called Fight: Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House, where Parnes and her co-author, Jonathan Allen, take us deep into the 2024 presidential campaign. In this conversation, which took place on May 12th, 2025, we talk about some of the juiciest details in the book, including why Barack Obama did not want Kamala Harris to take over the Democratic ticket. We take you into a turf war inside Trump world. And finally, talk about the advice Mike Pence gave to the Harris campaign. There's much, much more. You're not going to want to miss this conversation. Parnes' book is a must read for anyone trying to understand what happened in the last election. All right, Amie Parnes, thanks so much for taking some time to come on the World and Stuff podcast and chat with us. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I've been reading your book and just fascinated by the granular detail that it reports on both the Biden and Trump campaigns and then the Harris campaign. All of it is so fascinating. I want to get to that. It's going to be the crux of this episode, but I want to talk a little bit about your background because I found that interesting. You were an intern at the New York Times during the 2000 recount and everything that happened from Florida. I know you're from Miami. I'm from Tampa. That was right before I got interested in politics. The 2004 election was like my kind of bulb moment where I started to get interested and realize that this is all kind of actually very important.
Yeah.
But what was it about? Was there something about the 2000 recount that kind of sucked you in and gave you the bug?
Oh my God. I mean, everything about it was so fascinating and interesting to me. So, I was a pool reporter inside the emergency operations center where people were like literally like taking, like magnifying glasses and looking at the
Hanging
hanging
chads.
chads and pregnant chads. And I remember thinking, oh my God, like there was something about that was so fascinating to me. And every time I watched it, I just couldn't help but love it. And then, just the closeness of the race was so interesting to me. And that was the first time that I had truly seen the divide in the country. I remember I had friends who were pulling for Bush and I had friends who were pulling for Gore, and they were so adamant and fixated about their views. And I think all of it was just so fascinating to me, from a spectator's point of view.
Yeah, it's so funny because for me, it was the next election that I saw this divide. I think 9/11 kind of like shocked my conscience and started getting me interested in it. And then I was in college during the 2004 campaign, and I thought at that point, like, oh wow, the country is so divided. Things could never be so divisive as they
Yeah,
were in 2004. Seems quaint as it is
it
now.
does.
Um,
Yeah,
but
there were swift boats and all of that happening.
Yeah, which I mean, the Swift Boat campaign played prominently. I mean, the figures, Chris Lasavito was running essentially Trump's campaign in this. So like, there's a lot of echoes from that election now and the divisiveness, even though the sides have all switched. Like back then it was so controversial you were kind of an anti-American if you were against the Iraq war. It was like, I
Yeah.
stand with Bush and the troops. And now a lot of those Republicans have kind of switched sides to take even kind of a more liberal position on the Iraq war than was acceptable back then, which I find fascinating.
I know, totally fascinating. Yeah. But you're right. It does look kind of, we all were a little naive back then. It does look a little antiquated.
You worked at Politico during the Obama campaign and his presidency. What was that like working at, you know, everything about it seems like was new. You had this younger first African-American president and you're working inside Politico, which is like this up and coming news organization, really trying to do things a different way. Obama ran for president in a different way. Politico's covering and giving people access to their reporting in a different way. How did that shape your career?
It was another moment where I loved it. I mean, Politico was really great about innovating, how we look at politics and giving us sort of like a minute by minute look at, the players. I remember I was traveling with both Obama and McCain, and there was not a moment where I could just sit still. And that was new for me because my previous job, I had one deadline. around 5 o'clock every day. And this one was, it was really before social media started picking up, but there were blogs and I had to report at every minute, and everything was interesting. There were things on the plane that I was reporting. There were things on the ground, and so it was very minute by minute. And then right after Obama won, Politico started this blog called 44, where it was a minute, literally a minute by minute blog about the Obama presidency, and so that sort of led into my campaign experience and went right into Obama and this fascination that people had with him as this sort of like rock star politician, that they wanted to know every little thing about him.
And covering politics that way, minute by minute, as opposed to filing daily or even less frequently than that, is kind of before Twitter, being
Yeah.
able to kind of report and just, having the capacity to report granular details minute by minute. I imagine for reporters getting less time for peace and sleep, because, you're always worried about, it's not just you're worried about the, published at 5 o'clock or whatever, you're worrying about getting beat every 2 seconds.
Exactly. And, that was really ingrained in us, this first generation of Politico reporters. I think it made me a better reporter, but it was, people care about the stuff that's happening right now. They don't want to wait an hour. And so that changed in a lot of ways, the way I looked at politics.
So you've written 2 books about failed campaigns, which I find interesting. You wrote about Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign, and now your latest book is about mostly about the Kamala Harris campaign, but it covers Biden and Trump as well. It's called Fight: Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House. Again, I found it to be fascinating. I've been reading it over the last couple of weeks. I want to get into that book and some of the more interesting things I think you report out of that, but I want to back into it by actually reporting on a book that you wrote sandwiched in between those, which is Lucky: How Joe Biden Barely Won the Presidency. And I wonder if you think, because of that word lucky and how close it was, do you think Democrats misinterpreted the results of the 2020 election, that they had a mandate to do these big programs, the American Rescue Plan, Inflation Reduction Act, the big infrastructure package, and then also underestimated Trump's appeal? Because even after all the chaos of the first Trump administration, the impeachment, he still only lost by like 40,000 votes in 3 states.
Yeah. Right, right. And that's a really great question, Drew, because people at the time were asking us, why Lucky? He won in a big way. And the truth of the matter is, he didn't win in a big way. As you say, 40,000 votes over 3 states. And if Donald Trump would have done anything differently, if he would have been even a little more presidential during COVID, if he wouldn't have said the bleach line, there were a million like little things that could have changed the election. And so I do think that Democrats sort of took that win for granted. I think that even the Biden folks going into the White House, they went in there kind of with this very pompous attitude that they had gone in with a mandate. And I don't think that was the case. And I think if you read our book, Lucky, you see that we were sort of laying the groundwork at the time for, the problems that faced Biden, including right now. There's a lot of talk about his mental acuity and his age. And, we sort of left breadcrumbs at the time. When you look at, we talk about how his aides did not want him to do these late night speeches and events, because they saw even then that he was sort of fading and wasn't at his best. And so I think Lucky actually really holds up right now. And I've gotten that a lot from people who hadn't read Lucky before, went back and read it actually after this election, and learned a lot about where we are right now. And so I do think that in many ways they went in, as I said, and were completely blindsided by Trump's reemergence on the political scene.
Yeah, but the truth of it seems like, is he never really lost that appeal that he's had ever since he came down that elevator. And that appeal is still very strong and speaks to a large portion of the country that I think Democrats thought maybe that the liking that people have towards him faded after 2020 when obviously it hadn't. Yeah, I want to talk. So Biden gets into office, and he does have some big accomplishments. I mentioned some of them, but there's still, and also I think another very interesting and important part of the beginning of the Biden presidency is, Roe v. Wade being overturned and the fervor that boiled up in the 22 midterms. I guess that's my next question. Is like, so halfway through the Biden presidency, you have the 22 midterms, and Democrats are relatively successful. They win these Senate races in swing states, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. They do lose the House, but there was no Republican red wave. Do you think that lulled Democrats into a sense of security, Biden world into a sense of security? There are these looming cases for Trump that people think maybe they're going to kind of take care of themselves. And yeah, I guess the question is, did it lull Democrats and Biden world into a false sense of security?
I think it did, and that was one of the reasons why his aides and he thought that he should run again. That they thought that they had accomplished a lot, and they had. And they looked at the midterms and said, okay, it wasn't this red wave, and we held tight, we held strong. And then there were other moments like the State of the Union address where Biden was responding in real time. He had an arguably pretty good State of the Union address. So when you took all those things collectively, they were thinking, yeah, I mean, people are saying all this, but we're going to block out the noise. We know that we're going to win again, and they were pretty confident and smug, I think, going into the 2024 election, thinking that they had the wind at their backs, and that Biden had stepped up in all these really big moments. But then again, they were blindsided by the other side. They thought all these the criminal trials and the trials, and everything Trump was facing would bring him down and would change the minds of the electorate. And it didn't. I mean, when you look at what happened, people, they weren't happy with the way things were going, inflation being one of them, supply chain crisis, all of this sort of built and brewed. And they wanted something better. And they looked back at the Trump economy and they said, okay, this man might not be, he might be a little bit crazy, but he led the country in a good way. And I felt stronger about my checking account and the money coming in, and I wasn't paying so much at the grocery stores and at the gasoline pumps. And that meant a lot to them. And for whatever reason, Democrats sort of lost their way. The Democratic leadership, I should say, lost their way in kind of speaking to these voters in a very real way. They thought that they cared about all these other issues like abortion, which played out in a very strong way during the midterms. But when in fact it was it was really simple. The people really just cared about the economy, and they felt like the country wasn't heading in the right direction.
What about this idea that Biden was going to be a bridge candidate? This has been interpreted all different kind of ways, but I always hear Democrats saying, he said he wasn't going to run for a second term. Why the heck did he end up running for a second term? And I'm like, well, he didn't actually say that, but he made this comment that he sees himself as a bridge candidate. Was there ever any consideration in Biden world that bridge candidate means handing it off to the next generation in 24 and not running again?
No, I mean, I think he was pretty adamant on running, and we report this in the book. In 2022, he had talked about it with his aides, and they had looked around as the election drew closer, and they really felt like, why wouldn't he run? I mean, and this goes back to my earlier point, but he had a successful agenda. They thought that he was really, he had successes policy wise. He really stepped up in moments like the State of the Union, and he won. Most importantly, he beat Trump, which they thought he could do again. And they would use that kind of one point, like he was able to beat Trump the first time, and why wouldn't he be able to do it again? And Biden himself would tell people this, he would tell them publicly and privately and kind of bolster his case that way. And people were convinced. They thought, yeah, he was able to win. He can do it again. Maybe he has some issues, and he's on his mind is declining a little bit, but he's proven that he can step up in these key moments. And I think they thought that he could do it. Whereas, and we report this quite a big deal in the book, but all kinds of people were having these moments with him that in retrospect made them kind of take a second look and say, maybe we shouldn't have been okay with this. That it was a little bit worrisome. But for whatever reason, Biden and his aides had convinced people that he could do it.
They hadn't convinced Republicans and conservatives. It was a huge talking point on the right that Biden was in cognitive decline. I mean, people were even saying that he had dementia. Democrats were, no, nothing to see here. You should see him behind closed doors. He was a rock star in these meetings. And then there were obviously, there were liberal pundits that repeated that. And now there's all this talk about whether or not there was a media cover-up of Biden's condition during that time period. How do you react to that? What do you think about how Democrats behaved themselves amid those accusations and how the media covered it?
I don't agree, obviously, that it's a media cover-up, and I think that there was an effort by the White House to cover up how bad it was for him. And I think that if anyone is looking into cover up, they should really examine what was happening at the White House and why the White House and White House officials weren't so forthcoming about what Biden was facing and why they tried to cover up stories that were going to be written. I wrote a story one time about Biden's exercise routine, which is a pretty low-hanging fruit kind of story that most White Houses would want to play ball and participate in. And this White House at the time, I just asked, does he lift weights? Does he go for walks? Does he do anything? George W. Bush ran. Barack Obama played basketball and also had a pretty tight, morning routine. And the White House never would cooperate with a story like this. I tried for weeks and weeks, and eventually I published it sort of without their participation, with people wondering why they wouldn't just, say as much. And so there are so many stories in retrospect that I and other journalists tried to do, and the White House would always sort of, I think, gaslight us and say, oh, there's really nothing to see here. And so I do think that they served as, they were trying to protect him and block access. And I think that was one of the reasons why we didn't see him as often as other presidents, and that he wasn't taking the questions from reporters. I mean, certainly we kept asking and kept pushing for access, and they kept refusing.
As we get into 24, Trump is convicted in the Stormy Daniels case, but it becomes clear that he's not going to face trial in the other, kind of what the public, I think, sees as more serious cases, at least until after the election. Biden was kind of limping along. Inflation's still a problem. The border's still a problem. Poll numbers are not great. But it seems like in Biden world, they think that the debates are a chance to change the narrative. But as they start doing debate prep, I'm reading your book, it seems very obvious during debate prep that this is not going to go well.
Yeah.
Just tell us about how debate prep went and what were the red flags that people in Biden world just seem to run right past.
Yeah, I think that, going into the debate, they all felt like they needed a moment, a big moment, to change the trajectory of this race. They felt like Biden was losing. They had internal numbers sort of reflecting as much, and they tried to shake up the race. And they thought that an early debate would be an easy way to do that it would put Biden in the spotlight. Lots of people would be watching. And it turns out that it changed the race, but not the way they wanted. And there were people like Nancy Pelosi who tried to kind of tell Biden not to participate in such a thing. And of course, she used the excuse of, oh, why would you want to get on the same stage with Donald Trump? It would be so demeaning to you. Why would you want to do that to yourself? And I think people like her kind of knew going in that it wasn't the best idea. And that's why when you read the book, we open with, inside Nancy Pelosi's living room, and we're sitting with Jim Clyburn, the Democratic leader, and Al Sharpton, and they're all watching the debate alone. And these are moments that are typically shared. Lawmakers like to gather, and they like to have a good time and watch these things. Debate night is always a big deal in Washington. And in hindsight, you realize that they were watching they were all watching the debate alone because they almost knew, they had like a spidey sense that things would not go well. They didn't know, of course, that things would go entirely off the rails, but I think that they were really concerned going in. And I think that is really remarkable when you look at the way they were watching it. And that's sort of why we open in that way, to show people that they weren't confident that this would be a game changer for Biden.
And you take readers inside the debate prep, which I thought was super fascinating. He's not really able to go through debate prep for long periods of time. He gets tired. He's kind of sitting out by the pool, I guess, or something at one point. Can you talk about just his inability to be able to really put in the work? Because I think that was reflected when you watch the debate. The numbers are all jumbled up in his head and he can't really get anything straight. And I don't know if that's just kind of where he's at in his cognitive abilities or his inability to really sit and practice with the team.
Yeah, I mean, and of course he says that he was sick, and his aides noticed that he was sick, and had a bad cold and couldn't quite concentrate. But they didn't think that it was going to be like this. They tried to practice with him. They did mocks with him at Camp David, and then they traveled to Atlanta. They did another one, but I don't think, and they felt pretty good about it, I think, overall, but I don't think that they thought that it was going to go sideways and that the president would completely choke on stage. And so, and we have these moments like with Jill Biden going into, the former the first lady at the time, she goes in and speaks to a bunch of donors in Atlanta and says, we're going to win. She feels really good about it. And so no one really doubted that he would have this sort of horrible moment on stage. I think they all thought that while he was sick, that he would somehow come through.
So he doesn't come through. Biden bombs at the debate. Democrats are in chaos. It was interesting from the outside. It seemed like, Biden did so poorly in the debate, and then the process for Democrats coming to the conclusion that Biden had to drop out developed over time. But from reading your book, pretty much after the debate, there was consensus that Biden had to drop out, and what actually snowballed and was a process of Democrats being willing to say that out loud.
Yeah, I mean, that night, and my phone was blowing up, and everyone's phones were blowing up. I think that, and we look, once again, we take you to inside Pelosi's living room, and she is fielding texts from lawmakers and donors, and she's sort of in listening mode already. She already thinks that this is sort of a disaster playing out in front of everyone's eyes. But she is, she's hearing from one donor in particular who says as much, who says it's a disaster. And we report for the first time that she thinks that she's writing her husband, but she writes the donor back, who has already voiced this concern, and says, John Morgan thinks this is a disaster. So you can tell it's already sort of playing out in her head that this is not going well, that Biden shouldn't maybe continue to run. But she already knows that Kamala Harris can't take over. And she's, telling confidants in the days that follow, if he goes, she goes, meaning like if Biden drops out, then Kamala Harris should drop out too, because her biggest fear was that if they pushed Biden out, that Harris would be, the go-to and the nominee, and that scared her. She didn't think that Kamala Harris could ever win, and it turns out that she might have been right. I mean, she was right because Harris didn't win.
John Morgan of your local city bus or commercial for the people, who's a
Yes.
major, from Florida. I know him and his family well, and he's a major Democratic political donor who plays a major role in all presidential campaigns, and this one among them. So Biden eventually, I guess, let's not get to the point where Biden actually does drop out. Who do you think are the main people within the Democratic Party that are trying to get Biden through this and think that he can continue on? Who are the main players in that?
I mean, you have aides, his close confidants and aides like Mike Donnellan and Steve Ricchetti, and this very tight group of associates who think that he should continue. And they're sort of making the case, the upper brass of the campaign, to making the case to donors right off the bat that he can still do it. But everyone around them is saying, no, he can't continue on. And, there's all this discussion, like, who would it be? Would it be Kamala Harris? Barack Obama is one person who is hearing from folks and talking to people like Nancy Pelosi, and he thinks, and Nancy Pelosi starts to think that an open primary is probably the best way to go. And at the same time, you're hearing the Biden folks say, kind of undermining Kamala Harris, and we have this one scene in the book where his top aides are essentially writing to donors and saying, and undermining her and saying, if you guys push him out of this race, you're going to be left with her. And so there was a fight kind of ensuing even there, and a division happening. And it continues, the donors start getting really frustrated in those few weeks, and they start, choking the money. The money isn't coming fast and free anymore. And they come to a realization, the Biden folks, toward the end of these 24 days, where they think, okay, while polling wasn't so bad in the beginning, right after the debate, it's getting worse, and the money isn't there anymore. And things are looking really dire for him. And of course, he keeps pushing back, and he has a successful rally in Michigan. And, his folks think that he can kind of regain his stride somehow. But then you have forces like Nancy Pelosi, and she goes on Morning Joe, and she kind of says he has a decision to make, and Biden has already made his decision. So, yeah, he was battling.
That dance that Nancy Pelosi was doing on those morning shows was just a super interesting phenomenon in politics, because everyone's hanging on every little word that she says, but she's kind of repeating things that have already been decided. One of the things that becomes really clear after Biden decides to drop out is that Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi did not want the nominee to be Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
Why?
They were pretty adamant in telling people, they were both listening, particularly Pelosi was in listening mode with a lot of House members. She knew that Hakeem Jeffries couldn't really voice his opinion. So she steps up in that moment and is, talking to House members, and they're essentially telling her they are worried that they are in jeopardy of losing the House. And Pelosi, that scares her almost more than anything, even the presidency. So she goes in full force and, starts to apply pressure. And when she feels like his team is not hearing her and isn't receptive, and that Biden himself isn't receptive to this idea of stepping down, she essentially goes to bat on her own and says, without other folks, even Barack Obama, who was supportive of this idea, doesn't really voice it. His silence is deafening in that moment. But she's the one who kind of takes it on, goes on Morning Joe, says that Biden has a decision to make, and she knows exactly what she's doing in that moment. She goes on his favorite political show that he watches almost every morning, and expresses concern. Well, says that he has a decision to make, and this is a woman who does not mince words. She is very intentional about everything she does, and they are, watching this moment play out, and we take you inside the campaign, and they can't even believe what she's doing. They felt like they had finally regained their footing in the days leading up to that moment. Biden had told lawmakers that he was in it and he wasn't dropping out. And here she is. She goes on Morning Joe and delivers a dagger. And they're just in shock. And it's one of the reasons why I think there's so much animosity still to this day, kind of surrounding that particular moment.
It's such an interesting experiment in political messaging where I could just picture them going into this. Like, what are we going to say? Well, let's just say he has a decision to make. Well, he already said that he made the decision. But if we just keep saying that he has a decision to make, we'll get our point across without really having to say what we want to say.
Exactly.
But once Biden does step down, I'm interested in what was it about Harris that people like Obama and Pelosi thought was a losing hand for the Democrats to play.
They just didn't feel like she had what it took to beat someone like Donald Trump. And I think we should start there, but that she didn't, that she couldn't win in this sort of toxic environment, and that she hadn't been, throughout the White House, his aides had always sort of undermined her. She hadn't had strong performances. She wasn't good with the press, and they saw that there were some definite blind spots for her. And I think in the beginning, she surprised a lot of people, particularly around going into the Democratic convention and coming out of the convention, about how strong she was. It was a very strong convention. People felt energized by Kamala Harris and this effort. There were comparisons even made at the time, comparing her to Barack Obama. And, the Obamas sort of acknowledged that and said, we haven't seen this sort of energy since back then. But then she sort of goes into this mode where she's almost trying to run out the clock. She thinks that there's like 100 days left, and doesn't really get out there, doesn't do interviews. And at the same time, you're seeing Donald Trump in a very disciplined way, sort of, take the reins, go on all these podcasts, and was the nimble guy that he always has been. And so I think while he was worried about her coming out of the convention, and in the days leading up to the convention, he thought that his campaign was losing, and we can get into that. He actually, those were the moments where I think he really ran circles around her, and her campaign was trying to follow.
Did Biden ever entertain the possibility of the nominee being someone other than Harris once he stepped down? I mean, him and his aides were the ones saying that she was going to be a bad candidate.
Yeah, and they didn't, because they knew that she had to be it. I mean, for financial reasons, her name was already there, and they would lose all kinds of money if it was someone else. And, they would also upset the people who elected him, particularly Black women who supported him in a big way in 2020. They did not want to alienate those people. But what's fascinating about that moment is that he feels the need he almost wants to take a victory lap and doesn't want to immediately endorse her. And so you have this sort of tension playing out where he wants to take a couple of days and then endorse her. And she gets him on the phone and says, okay, are you going to endorse me? And he says, you have my support, kid. And she knows that that isn't the endorsement she needs in that moment. She sees that, the wolves are circling and that other candidates might jump in, and she needs his support locked down. And so she pushes him to endorse her right away. And that was a really key moment, I think, because she knew that she had to, energize the base right away and not wait any longer.
Yeah, Harris showed some muscle there in the beginning of early stages of her campaign, just being able to lock it down and prevent any serious challengers from bubbling up. And I think that maybe gave Democrats some sense of security about what her campaign would be like. Democrats eventually coalesce around Kamala Harris. One of her first big decisions is whether or not to keep the Biden team or bring on a new team. It's kind of like stability versus change. And it seems to me
Yeah.
that decision set the framework for the whole campaign.
Yeah, it really did. Her first big decision was whether to keep Jen O'Malley Dillon, Biden's campaign chair, on board, and she does. She had worked with Jen a lot in the White House. She knew her. She trusted her. But I think that when you look back in that moment, there were a lot of people. She did bring in some of her own people, but they were kind of relegated to a back room. They weren't allowed to make decisions. The Biden folks were still making these key decisions. And so I think all of this sort of hurt her in the long run, that she was almost running his campaign and not her own campaign. And when her people did sort of voice their opinion, they were kind of, almost, they were dismissed. And I think that caused a lot of tension. And you had this internal tension. Campaigns are tense to begin with, but when you have the Biden folks and then some of the Kamala Harris folks come in, there was this sort of, civil war playing out inside the campaign, where the Harris folks wanted their own power, and the Biden folks, were already there and were already used to calling the shots. And so we go into quite a bit of, kind of peeling back the layers of that tension, those tensions as well.
Let's talk about the Trump campaign a little bit. So he came off this, he survived an assassination attempt in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
The RNC was a coronation. He has a vice presidential pick. Does he view Biden getting out of the race as a bad thing?
He is really upset to begin with. He thinks that the Democratic Party is pulling a stunt on him. And that is one of the key moments where he wonders if he needs to shake up his own campaign, and bring in some old characters like Corey Lewandowski, who helped him run in 2016. And he considers that. He thinks maybe Chris LaCivita and Susie Wiles aren't doing him any favors, and they didn't see this coming, and they didn't really warn him and prepare the campaign as they should have. And so he considers bringing in this old guard. But then he does something that's very unlike him. He chooses the route of stability, and not the route of chaos. And so I think that was a really key moment, that he sort of allows and enables Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita to continue to call the shots. And they had been running a very disciplined, tight campaign. And it's one of the reasons a lot of people have credited the campaign with winning, because they kept their heads down. They didn't allow for much drama. What's interesting is my co-author and I were obviously digging around and seeing what was happening and trying to figure out if there was a lot of drama inside the campaign. And we realized that compared to 2020 and 2016, you didn't really see that as much. There were, of course, these key moments like the one I just mentioned, but the drama was really on the Democratic side this time.
Yeah, it's interesting. During that summer after the conventions, we have this whole like brat summer phenomenon that's going on. Kamala Harris has all this social media is flooded with positive Kamala Harris content. She's rising slightly in the polls. You mentioned the tensions inside the Trump campaign. This Lewandowski versus LaCivita rivalry is super interesting and plays out on an election night in a hilarious way. But the reality is like the polls really, the fundamentals of the campaign didn't change that much despite all the upheaval of the summer. Everything from the convictions to the assassination attempt to the debate between Harris and Trump, we're still kind of stuck in this same partisan ecosystem where the polls are moving back 2-3 points, and still essentially the fundamentals are the same, which I think the Trump campaign does a very good job of recognizing. And they're looking to try to find new voters. Where can we find people that haven't voted in the past and maybe we could sway to our side? And they key in on young men who listen to podcasts. Who was the brainchild of finding those people? Because to me, that's really the deciding factor of the election, the ability to identify those voters and then speak to them.
Yeah, and what was so fascinating is Barron Trump, of all people, is the one who's calling the shots and telling people on his father's campaign, you guys ought to call, and get him on these podcasts. And then the president himself, the former president at the time, is essentially saying, yeah, let Barron know about these podcasts. Ask him if these podcasts are a good idea. And so Barron Trump is really, really, I think, responsible for putting his father on some of these key shows like Joe Rogan. And I think that is how he found these new voters, by going on these podcasts and speaking to young men in particular, and men who were kind of put off by Kamala Harris in a lot of ways, and Trump resonated more with them. And at the same time, Kamala Harris is almost realizing a little too late that she needs to do that as well. And there's this big effort on her campaign's part to get her on Joe Rogan's podcast. And they go back and forth, and they can't quite land a date. It doesn't work. And then at the end, she essentially has a rally in Texas in October on a Friday night, just to be within arm's reach of Joe Rogan's podcast in Austin, Texas. And the whole thing kind of blows up because her campaign aides say, okay, we're going to be there on this date. And the response that comes back from Rogan's people is, oh yeah, well, he's already off that day. He's taking a personal day. And what comes to be is Donald Trump is actually interviewing with Rogan on that day. It's such a missed opportunity in a lot of ways, I think, for the Harris folks. They should have. I know a lot of people read this passage in our book and said, why couldn't they just, take any day and just go and do it? What's with all the negotiating? And I think that was a really big problem for her, that her side wasn't as nimble as his side in kind of trying to do all of this, to get on these podcasts, speak to these folks. Everything was still very, everything was reliant on data, and they weren't moving as quickly on their side.
Yeah, there has been a lot made of the fact that Trump did Joe Rogan and Harris didn't. But from reading your book, I was kind of struck by, it seemed like the Harris camp wanted to do it, and Rogan kind of denied Harris an opportunity that he gave Trump to speak to his audience.
Yeah. I mean, there was definitely an effort made to get her on there. And going so far as putting a rally in Texas there, when people were kind of questioning at the time and saying, why is she doing a rally in Texas? Shouldn't she be in Pennsylvania or Michigan? And the campaign at the time was saying, oh yeah, we can do these rallies from wherever. And trying to come up with an excuse for why they were there. But they were definitely more than interested in making this happen. And they felt like Rogan's folks were essentially playing games with them.
Yeah, the whole Houston rally with Beyonce was really a ruse to get her in Texas so that she could do the Joe Rogan interview. And then he essentially lied to them and said he wasn't working that day when he was actually interviewing Trump, and then never gave her an opportunity to do it. I really think that kind of changes the narrative about what's been said about her, I don't know, reluctance to do that interview.
Yeah. And, they tried in all kinds of ways, and they even asked if he could fly out to wherever she was, and he hadn't done that for anyone. He made one exception one time. But I think they were kind of a little bit put off by it. And it comes down to essentially one time where they said, okay, we'll do it again, but you have to come back here. And her folks essentially say, you only get one shot at doing this. The back and forth is so fascinating on so many levels. And I think Democrats read that part of our book and got really annoyed about why it just couldn't happen and why all the negotiation. And it's really a fascinating thing to read when you really figure out what was essentially happening behind the scenes.
Blew my mind. I mean, I think there's probably an argument that could be made that she should have been kicking down Joe Rogan's door and demanding that he allow her on the podcast instead of like, maybe if it works out, I'll do it. That would be cool. But yeah, I thought it was super interesting. Back to that Houston Beyonce rally. Do you know why she didn't sing at that? That was such like an interesting. What the heck was she came, but she wouldn't sing? Well, why?
Yeah, and it still kind of irks a lot of people on the Harris campaign. They wanted her to sing, and she didn't sing. And a source told us it was one of the reasons was because she didn't have the right microphone. But I think that people were just happy to have her there and participating. But it was kind of a funny moment, and still no real explanation for why she didn't sing.
You talked about Harris was kind of kept under wrap during the first month of the campaign before she does the joint interview with Walls. The message that she was getting from President Biden and Biden's staff, who ended up being her campaign staff, no daylight. Kept hearing that from Biden and from her staff, no daylight between Harris and Biden. Is that vanity from Biden and his people? Or is that just the kind of realization that, look, you were in the administration, you're the vice president, you can't separate yourself from us?
Yeah, I mean, it really became a huge moment. And, we revealed this for the first time that in the hours leading up to the first debate with Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, Joe Biden calls and essentially tells her, no daylight, kid. At the same time, the White House and Kamala Harris campaign had a different understanding. They were led to believe that they could distance themselves from Joe Biden as much as they needed to. But I think the principals had a different sort of agreement between the two of them. And I think he thought that she really needed to, tie herself to what they had accomplished, and there was no need for her to essentially pivot and distance herself. But the thing is, this was a change election, and people were looking for change. They were unsatisfied with how things were going with Biden, and I think she needed that distance to make the case, and wasn't able to get it. And in some ways, they tried to tweak that and fix it. I mean, one moment we look at is the moment when she goes on The View and she's asked about what she would do differently, and she ends up saying not a thing, that she supports the president. But they had planned for that moment. And what she was supposed to say was, yes, I support what we did. Going forward, my administration is going to look a lot different than his administration. And for whatever reason, she doesn't say it. And now we kind of know, that the president was sort of applying pressure and telling her that, even though it's something he still denies to this day, which is really interesting. Saying that wasn't true, that he told her that he could essentially have as much distance as she needed. But you could see how everything was playing out, and it didn't appear that way.
Yeah, you had an interesting quote, I think, from a Harris campaign staffer in reference to that answer to The View was like, that's not what we practiced. I don't know why she said that. There seems like there could have been a million better answers. I want to ask you one quick question about Harris's choice for VP. There's been a lot of talk of Josh Shapiro. He's the popular governor of Pennsylvania. He was on the short list. Pennsylvania is a state that Harris desperately wanted to win. She ended up not picking him. Did she not pick him because he's Jewish and pro-Israel, and we were in the midst of a summer of protests against the war in Gaza?
I think it was definitely one reason. But I think the biggest reason she didn't pick him was because she didn't really feel that comfortable with him. And I think her folks felt like they needed to be wary of his own political ambitions and what he would do down the road, and how he could kind of undermine her. And, what's interesting is the Biden people had the same sort of suspicions about her coming in, and wondered if she could be a loyalist. And in the end, she was a loyalist, and she stood by Biden in every sort of way. And I think she found the same sort of rapport with Tim Walz. I know that when we talked to sources about her final interviews, she just felt more comfortable with him, and she felt like he would be a better working partner. And I think he reminded her in a lot of ways of Joe Biden and the relationship that she had with Biden, and she knew that he wouldn't be undermining her. And so I think a lot of it was, her own rapport with him. But certainly, like, let's not forget where the Democratic Party is in that moment, where she is considering Shapiro, and the party is trying to regain its footing. They are fractured. They have just gone through the candidate switch, and they didn't want to do anything that could jeopardize her winning. And I think picking Shapiro would have taken on a life of its own, and it would have caused its own friction during the convention and in the weeks after.
Anecdote from the book I wanted to ask you about is there was this chance meeting between Mike Pence, the former vice president during Trump's first term, and some top Harris campaign staffers where he actually offered some advice. How did that meeting happen, and what did he say?
Oh my gosh. So he essentially is on a plane. They are going to the debate, the vice presidential debate, or the presidential debate rather, and flying there. And so her aides are essentially trying to, they recognize that he is on the plane, and they ask him for advice. And, it's just this very strange moment where politics is, it's like you can't make these moments up. Like, how can they're flying to Pennsylvania to do this presidential debate, and here's Mike Pence flying with them, wearing a baseball cap, kind of trying to mask himself, trying to go kind of incognito, and there he is. And they're essentially asking him for advice, like what kind of advice he would give to Harris. And do you recall what he says?
I think he said something about how she's good when she's on the attack, but she's not great defending her record.
Exactly. And so that's exactly sort of what plays out. He ends up giving like very good advice. And they honestly can't believe that they're in that moment. And it's a moment that my co-author and I found really funny. And it's like those moments where you can't make this stuff up, that truth is stranger than fiction.
Mike Pence giving advice to the Harris campaign. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I wanted one more quick anecdote I wanted to ask that played a role in the book. And at the time, Joe Biden visited this firehouse in Pennsylvania. It was on 9/11, and he put on a Trump 2024 hat. He was fooling around with some guys there. At the time, I remember thinking it really wasn't that big of a deal, but inside the Harris campaign, they were pissed.
They were so angry. And a lot of people, even to this day, thought that Biden was sort of undermining her and trying to send a message that people should vote for Trump. It's a question that I get asked all the time. Was he really supporting Trump secretly? And I don't think that moment did the Harris campaign any favors. And it sort of tracks with another moment later in the campaign where in the final days, she's giving her closing argument, and Biden is essentially at the White House and throwing cold water and calling, Trump's people garbage, and completely undermining Kamala Harris. And it reminded a lot of people of something that Hillary Clinton had done, where she called Trump supporters irredeemable, And it really, really angered a lot of the Harris folks at the time.
I want to ask you about the final pitches from the candidates, because it seemed like Harris was, she had this big rally at the Ellipse. I was there, huge crowd, big focus on democracy. January 6th was the significance of that location. It's where Trump delivered his speech before that happened. Trump has a rally at Madison Square Garden, comedians saying offensive things. It's more of a carnival. But for whatever reason, it seemed like Trump kind of captured the moment with that more lighthearted, controversial campaign that drives headlines. It's kind of, and Harris was, and I think there was even a debate about this inside the Harris campaign. She was kind of backward looking at it was a trip down memory lane versus looking at the future. Just what do you make of the final pitches?
I mean, I thought that what Trump was doing, going to McDonald's, speaking to people, being relatable, those were moments that really hurt her. And I think that she was sort of all over the place, and her campaign was all over the place, trying to appeal to people on different levels, different issues. And they weren't really homing in on the economy and what was really on voters' minds. And so I think that he handled the closing argument in a much better, more relatable, more palpable way to a lot of voters. And I think that it was a winnable race in the end. She thinks that she's going to win. Tim Walz thinks that he's going to win. We take you inside their rooms at the end where they're completely shocked that they had lost. They thought that they were going to see a victory that night. They were prepared for a victory. And what's interesting is, and Donald Trump is nervous. He's at Mar-a-Lago kind of freaking out and wondering if he's going to win. And he ends up winning and they end up losing. And I think the most kind of revealing moment that we have in this book, and I don't want to give too much away, Drew, for people who haven't read it, but that she feels she's almost gaslit by her own campaign. She thinks that she's going to win. She's led to believe that she's going to win. And it was a winnable race. And there were certain moments, I think, that kind of killed it for her. And it's really interesting when you see sort of the dynamics on both sides and how, she was very close to winning, but she could have run a stronger race if a lot of things had happened for her.
Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it at that, but people should definitely go and get the book, Fight: Inside the Wildest Battle for the White House. Amie Parnes, your co-author, is Jonathan Allen, who I didn't mention in the beginning. Apologies to him. He's an amazing journalist as well. Just as I said, the granular details, taking you inside the campaign. Like if you want to know what happened inside the 2024 presidential campaign on both sides, definitely read this book. I know also you've been writing a lot about where Democrats go next. You were on Gavin Newsom's podcast. People should go to thehill.com. They could read your articles. You've been doing a lot on where Democrats are, where they're going, and also what's happening inside the Trump administration. You've been writing about tariffs possibly being his Achilles heel. And so great reporting on that too. And people should go check you out there. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for this book. It was a fascinating read. And we appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Drew. I appreciate it.